very, very early on the Wednesday morning between the death and the funeral. And I just sat down and wrote it. And it took about an hour and a half and just came pouring out, really. Actually, it's interesting. Sounds rather sort of bizarre, but I did go to Diana's coffin the day after I'd written it. And
the man who stood in Westminster Abbey in September 1997 and made a vow to 2 billion people has spent nearly 3 decades keeping that promise in silence. No memoirs, no documentary deals, no carefully orchestrated press moments, just a locked gate at Althorpe and a conscience shaped by grief, guilt, and an iron sense of duty. Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl Spencer, Diana's youngest brother, has always been the quietest figure in the loudest royal story of the modern era. But in early 2026, something shifted. A proposal landed on his desk, carrying the logos of Netflix, Prince Harry, and Meghan Markle. And the man who had said nothing publicly for almost 30 years replied with exactly 4 words. Is this a joke? Those 4 words did not arrive from arrogance. They arrived from history. And to understand why they matter, why they may have permanently altered the Sussex trajectory, you need to understand the man who said them, the wound that made him, and the vault he has been protecting ever since the day he buried his sister on that island at Althorpe. Charles Spencer was 33 years old when Diana died. He wrote the eulogy in a single sitting, early on a Wednesday morning between her death and her funeral, in roughly an hour and a half, the words pouring out of him in a way he later described as almost involuntary. And then he did something that almost no one outside his closest circle knew about until years later. The night before the funeral, he walked alone into the room where Diana's coffin lay, unfolded the piece of paper, and read every single word of that eulogy directly to her. Not to a camera, not to a rehearsal audience, to his sister. He wanted her to hear it first. That detail alone tells you everything you need to know about Charles Spencer's relationship with Diana's memory. It was never about the world. It was always and only about her. The eulogy itself became one of the most electrifying public speeches of the 20th century. When he delivered it in Westminster Abbey before the Queen, Prince Philip, the future king, and a congregation connected by satellite to an estimated 2 billion viewers around the world, his words detonated something in the crowd outside. The applause that began in the streets rolled like thunder through the nave of the church. He promised that Diana's sons would be raised with warmth and imagination. He promised they would be shielded from the cold institutional rigidity he believed had destroyed their mother. He said it looking directly at the royal family seated feet away from him. He did not flinch. And then, when it was over, he returned to Northamptonshire and essentially disappeared from the public conversation for the better part of 3 decades. That disappearance was not accidental. It was deliberate. And the reason it was deliberate brings us to the part of this story that most coverage has never properly examined. Charles Spencer carries a guilt that people close to him describe as one of the defining forces of his adult life. It is not the guilt of someone who acted with malice. It is the guilt of someone who acted with love and trust and was, in the process, used as an unwitting instrument in one of the most damaging media events of his sister's life. By long-standing accounts, confirmed through the 2021 Dyson investigation commissioned by the BBC, it was Charles Spencer who first brought Diana into contact with Martin Bashir, the journalist who would go on to conduct the 1995 Panorama interview. At the time, Spencer believed Bashir was someone Diana could trust. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was the full extent of how that access had been engineered. Bashir had presented fabricated bank statements to Spencer, fake documents designed to suggest that members of Diana's inner circle were being paid to surveil and betray her. He manufactured evidence of conspiracy to convince a frightened, isolated woman that the only safe move available to her was to sit in front of a camera and speak. Lord Dyson's 2021 report found that Bashir had deceived Spencer, that the BBC had subsequently covered up evidence of what had occurred, and that the whole architecture of that panorama interview had been built on psychological manipulation and forged material. When the full truth emerged, Spencer gave a statement that was unusually raw for a man of his composure. He said that had he not been deceived, he would never have introduced Bashir to Diana, and that his sister almost certainly would never have agreed to the interview. He described a feeling that is essentially impossible to quantify, the understanding that you played a role, however innocent and however unknowing, in one of the most profound exploitations of someone you loved. The sealed archives at Althorpe, the decades of refusals, the decision to bury Diana on the island rather than surrender her resting place to institutional control, all of it, according to those who know Spencer well, flows from that guilt. He has been doing penance, making absolutely certain that no one, not a journalist, not a streaming platform, not a family member with a content deal, will ever again use Diana's vulnerability as a product. This is the man that the Sussex operation apparently decided to approach in early 2026, and this is where the story takes a turn that deserves far more attention than it has received. The proposal reportedly presented to Spencer was framed as a grand anniversary documentary, timed to coincide with the 30th year since Diana's death in August 2027. On its surface, it was dressed in the language of tribute and legacy, fronted by Harry, backed by Netflix, with what sources described as a substantial streaming budget. The pitch apparently presented itself as the definitive Diana film, the emotional, cinematic, authorized account that had never been made. And to make it work, it needed things that no previous documentary had ever been able to obtain. It reportedly wanted access to Althorpe itself, the childhood home where Diana grew up, the lake, the grounds, the island where she is buried. It wanted the private Spencer family archives. It reportedly asked for Diana's personal handwritten diaries, pages she wrote entirely for herself, never intended for any public eye. It wanted the unseen home movies, the unguarded private footage of Diana as a child and young woman that has never been broadcast, never been licensed, and exists only because Charles Spencer has kept the door locked for 28 years. Without those materials, the documentary would be built from the same recycled public domain footage used in every Diana film made since 1997. With them, it would be something categorically different. But there was one more element to the pitch. The element that Spencer reportedly found not merely objectionable, but almost incomprehensible. The proposal apparently sought to draw an explicit, direct line between Diana's conflict with the establishment and Meghan Markle's conflict with the same institution. It wanted to position Meghan as the modern continuation of Diana's story, the 21st century version of the woman who refused to be silenced. In effect, it was asking Spencer to open the vault his sister's memory lived in and use its contents to formally crown a successor. Spencer had been watching. He had seen the aquamarine ring at the 2018 wedding reception, Diana's pale blue stone on Meghan's hand at the evening's camera's guaranteed moment. He had watched the butterfly earrings appear, then the Cartier tank watch, then the gold bracelets, each piece surfacing at precisely the events where photography was not merely possible, but mathematically certain. He had watched the 2021 Oprah Winfrey interview, sitting alone in the house where Diana grew up, and recognized something in its architecture that would have stopped any serious student of modern royal history cold. The hushed lighting, the confessional stillness. One woman, one sympathetic interviewer, one faceless institution accused of silencing her mental health, closing every door, leaving her with no recourse but the public. As journalist and royal commentator Valentine Lowe, who covers the palace for The Times, has reported extensively on the fracture between the royal family and the Sussexes, the parallels between the Oprah interview and Diana's 1995 panorama appearance were striking enough to prompt significant private commentary within the Spencer family and beyond. The critical difference, the one that Spencer reportedly could not move past, was context. Diana gave her Panorama interview while still trapped inside the institution, with no exit in sight and everything to lose. The 2021 Oprah interview was filmed from a villa in California. After the departure, with a production apparatus attached and streaming deals already in place, one was a cry for help. The other, whatever your sympathies, was a launch. Spencer had watched the Netflix documentary series in which Harry and Meghan framed their departure from royal life in explicitly Dianesque terms. Hunted by the same machine, destroyed by the same forces. He had watched, piece by piece, as Diana's tragedy was converted into someone else's origin story without a single phone call to Althorpe. And now the proposal in front of him wanted the vault, the diaries, the island, the originals, to complete that transfer, to fit Diana's halo formally and permanently to a different head. Of course he said what he said. The surprise, as anyone who understands his history would recognize, is that he kept it to 4 words. But the refusal was only the first movement of this story. The second movement is the one that almost no coverage has paused long enough to examine, and it changes the landscape entirely. According to sources described in reporting by veteran royal correspondent Robert Jobson, whose decades of palace access have made him one of the more reliable voices in this space, Charles Spencer did not simply reject the proposal and return to silence. He is said to have written to Prince William a private letter urging the future king to publicly address the deepening crisis between himself and Prince Harry, and more broadly, to more actively defend the standing of the monarchy in the face of the ongoing Sussex media operation. To understand why that letter matters, you have to understand William's impossible position. He is the future king. Every public move he makes generates consequences that ripple through the institution he will one day lead. He cannot publicly block his brother's media projects without manufacturing exactly the headline the Sussex operation most needs: palace censorship, establishment persecution, royal family silences its own. When the institution blocks something, it always reads as the powerful protecting themselves. But when Diana's own brother, the man who stood at her funeral and challenged the Windsors to their faces in front of the entire world, calls a project a joke, that reads as something entirely different. That reads as family honor. It cannot be spun. There is no palace to blame. There is only one brother, in the most fundamental human sense, telling another brother what he thinks of what is being done with the memory of the woman they both loved. William, by this reading, never had to lift a finger. The one man free to say no without consequence was the one man with the moral standing to make that no impossible to dismiss. Charles Spencer's letter to William was not, by any account, a peace overture toward Harry. The reported contents were strategic in nature, not sentimental. Spencer apparently argued that the royal family's policy of total silence, treating Harry's media activities with complete indifference, was producing a dangerous imbalance. By saying nothing, the family was handing the Sussexes an unchallenged microphone, allowing a single narrative about the institution to dominate global coverage without any counterweight. He is said to have expressed concern that Harry himself, once the embodiment of military service and genuine public affection, had been reduced in the eyes of much of the world's media to a reactive figure defined entirely by his wife's commercial ambitions rather than his own identity. Spencer's position, as reported, was not hostile to Harry. It was, in a complicated way, almost protective of him. An argument that the current situation was diminishing the younger prince rather than serving him. The state of the Sussex media empire at the time of that proposal tells its own story. The $100 million Netflix deal, the 5-year arrangement that had bankrolled the California chapter, was reportedly approaching expiry, with renewal far from guaranteed. The lifestyle series with Love, Meghan had attracted reviews that ranged from mocking to brutal across the full spectrum of British media, including, notably, publications with no royalist sympathies whatsoever. The Guardian, which had repeatedly condemned the treatment of Meghan and editorially favored abolishing the monarchy, gave the series a single star, and one of its writers suggested it might be the last project she made for the platform. When a paper ideologically predisposed to support you reaches that verdict, you are not dealing with a bias problem. You are dealing with a product problem. The Spotify arrangement had already ended. The American Riviera Orchard lifestyle brand was not gaining the commercial traction the operation required. The Diana documentary was not a passion project. It was a rescue flare. The single card in the deck guaranteed to draw a global audience precisely because it carried the one story bigger than anything the Sussexes had built for themselves. And the man at Althorpe tore it up before breakfast. The deeper family fracture remains in place, reporting from multiple palace sources, including those cited by Jobson and by journalist and broadcaster Omid Scobie, whose 2023 book Endgame offered a detailed if contested account of the Sussex departure, confirms that the central obstacle to any reconciliation is not sentiment, but trust. The royal family's documented fear is not Meghan's grievances. It is her content calendar. The concern, stated plainly in multiple accounts, is that any private family exchange, any honest conversation, any quiet moment over a shared meal, risks being filed, packaged, and converted into a streaming product. It is the same concern that drove the institution's response to the Panorama interview, expressed in a different register for a different era. Harry has reportedly offered gestures of transparency, including sharing diary dates with the family. King Charles has maintained a deliberate distance across the thousands of miles separating him from his younger son. William and Catherine have not spoken to the Sussexes in years. That is not a temporary rupture. That is a settled state of affairs. And yet there is something genuinely painful in Harry's position that deserves to be held alongside everything else. He has a dimension of his mother's story that nobody alive can replicate or replace. What it was like to be her child, to walk with her through hospital wards and homeless shelters, to lose her at 12 years old in a Paris tunnel, and then be required to carry that grief down the nave of Westminster Abbey in front of the entire planet. That experience belongs to him. It cannot be curated away or locked in an archive. The question is whether the vehicle chosen to carry that experience, the production apparatus, the streaming deals, the commercial framing, serves Diana's memory or consumes it. That is the question Spencer has been answering for 28 years, and his answer has never changed. The villain in this story, if you need to locate one, does not live at Althorpe, or in Montecito, or within the walls of Kensington Palace. It lives in the machinery itself, the commercial apparatus that looks at a mother's handwritten diaries and calculates their streaming value, the algorithm that converts a family's worst years into a platform debut, the industry that discovered, in the grief of one of the most famous women who ever lived, an asset so inexhaustible it is still generating revenue 3 decades after her death. Charles Spencer has been fighting that machinery quietly, without applause, without press releases, and without a single interview that opened the vault even a fraction. He has protected something rare in the modern media age, a private Diana, a real unguarded, fully human version of the woman the world thinks it owns. She exists only because one man keeps saying no. The vault at Althorpe remains shut. The proposal has been rejected. The Sussex Netflix deal faces its most uncertain renewal yet. And somewhere between Montecito and London, two brothers who grew up sharing the loss of the same extraordinary woman have found themselves on opposite sides of a line that nobody drew, but everyone can feel. Diana's brother has spoken, not in the language of headlines or streaming platforms or carefully timed exclusives, but in the only language he has ever used, the language of the promise he made to her the night before they buried her. The question left on the table for all of us is the same one this entire saga has been circling from the beginning. Is there a version of Diana's legacy that honors her memory rather than monetizing it? And if so, who gets to decide what that looks like? The man with the grief or the man with the gate? Whatever the answer, the gate is closed. And after 28 years of silence, the 4 words that came through it may have said more than any documentary ever could.